So we've got our very last talk of the forum today, and that is William Tate. And William is the managing director at PwC, where he leads AWS Technology, the firm's industrial products and services practice. And he'll be sharing how we can threat model to mitigate threats in the cloud. So William, hand it over to you.
We're going to first look at what we consider the state of cloud security practices. And essentially, when we are thinking about 2021, we have to look at it from a post-pandemic. Whenever we get through COVID, we have to look at how are we going to evolve, what the new format is going to be from a cloud perspective as relates to security. And one of the things, I'll just run through a few of the items here on the slide, is that when we think about it post-pandemic standpoint, we should focus on cloud and hybrid technical landscapes because Forrester and others indicate that that particular market area is growing, right? And you also note that there are declining budgets. It requires stricter justification for spending. And I think this was probably more evident when we had that super major attack, when we had the SolarWinds attack, which was basically a nice playbook of attack techniques and tactics, right? And so when you look at all of that in the context of what is going on from a security standpoint, most companies would then have to look at, well, how do we do threat modeling today? What exactly is threat modeling? What things can go wrong? But what's important to note is that threat modeling is not hacking. It's not penetration testing, but it is looking at it from an evergreen artifact standpoint. What are the things that can occur in the environment? How do we model it, given that things are changing so quickly? If you think about it, like in a summary standpoint, you would say that an organization might use threat modeling to obtain insights into the threats and into the attacks to which is at risk. And, modeling in general will help quantify the risk and deliver recommendations so that one could consider budgeting and technical improvements for security operations. One example that comes to mind when we're thinking about this is threat modeling. For an organization, it may uncover a need to, let's say, do a redesign of the cloud network infrastructure or to increase resiliency against lateral movement. And in this case, that type of solution, those solution components would have been compromised. But the change, though, might require cloud services and people, which will impact operational budgets. And so if we sum this up, it basically says that since adversarial attacks evolved to circumvent mitigation strategies, then threat modeling in of itself must be incorporated into each and every organization's security practice so that we can ensure risks are continually assessed for the technical landscape, especially as the landscape continues to evolve. Now, we look at this, though, as we say that when we're thinking about these items, when you're thinking about threat modeling as a whole, regardless of where you are from a cloud transformation standpoint, you will always have to deal with unknowns. And what we look at unknowns in generally 4 different buckets here, right? You have threat modeling as it relates to your security organization, threat modeling as it relates to the infrastructure as the platforms, modern applications in whatever those cloud workloads happen to be. And the final one over there is enterprise security services. What does that really mean? Well, if you think about it at a high level, your journey to the cloud would touch each one of these areas. And so it's important to pay attention to threat modeling for each one of these areas. So if you think about it from transform the security organization, that first one would have to determine if new or updated security operation tools or processes are necessary. And the way we do that is we evaluate threats against the current security operating model. whatever that happens to be for your organization. Then the other is when you're looking at secure cloud infrastructure. You can say, well, when we're trying to detect abnormal privilege account activity, as an example, or infrastructure changes performed outside of change management processes, those are some of the things that you look at. And when you do that, though, you have new workloads or you have compute nodes deployed with unpatched images or vetted software, or installation of malicious code. So that's what occurs from an infrastructure standpoint that we have to pay attention to from a threat modeling standpoint. When we look at modern applications or workloads, secure cloud workloads, that's really about threat modeling to assure that software is designed to mitigate what we would know as common threat attacks, such as SQL injection or security token spoofing, things of that nature. And so by the time we get to the enterprise security services for the cloud, we basically, again, want to just make sure that we protect against unauthorized disclosures. Okay. And we also look at it from the perspective of cloud network design, where we mitigate through threats through segmentation, access control, so that we prevent lateral movement. And those are the things that we have to look at. And basically what that helps is that it allows us to look at it from a perspective of where a threat actor moves freely from system to system, hijacking those resources at will. And so if you take that and you say, okay, now that I understand that, though, where in the world, if I have a large enterprise, where do I really start? How do I make this happen? Okay. Rather than boiling the ocean, I have to start somewhere. And a good place to start, though, which is what we propose most of the time, is that we start with a six-step process, right? And we start with customer journeys. And customer journeys basically helps one to understand all of the customer interactions. So you would look at your customer from whether it's a internal or external customer. It just allows you to look at the interaction in your customer journey. What are the enabling architecture components that would help in that particular journey as well? And then you move from there and you look at, based off of the information that I've gotten from my customer journey, based off of whatever the enabling architecture components happen to be, then I build out a solution model. And so that solution model is essentially a data flow, not a traditional data flow diagram, of course, but it's a customer data flow. So it takes you from the beginning to the end for a particular user, or actually for that user that you've identified from a customer journey standpoint. And within that, we're identifying authorization, we're identifying authentication, whatever those systems happen to be, what the appropriate data storage assets that one would have in that particular architecture, and whether or not that architecture, any third party external hosted components for that particular architecture. And it also takes notes of whatever the API structures happen to be. So in essence, if you think about it from a pure architectural standpoint, you're looking at what the overall solution architecture looks like. And you're painting that picture of the entire data flow so that you can track it piece by piece by piece by piece. And we'll go into each one of these just so that we can delve just a little bit deeper. But after you create that solution model, we move to identifying really the crown jewels. What are the mission critical components there? What are those high value assets that basically impact the type of work that you're doing, or how your external client base sees you. These are the crown jewels that we look at. So that's the third piece. And then after that, then you move up or over to developing a threat model and identifying trust zones. So you might use something like Stride or and also MITRE ATT&CK. But these are basically things that one would use to develop the threat model so that we can see or model what it could possibly look like. And then at the end there, we establish an overall threat model library as well. And then the next two pieces that one would want to look at is how do we, after we've gone through the customer journey, after we've looked at the solution architecture, the actual model, looking at the data flow, after we've identified what those crown jewels happen to be in developing a threat model, what is the actual plan though? How do we identify that? How do we actually mitigate these items? And so what we then do is we create what's considered as attack vectors. So we validate whatever those attack vectors are that we've found. We look at what some of the best practices are, things of that nature. And you see that last bullet point there is proposing what the project charter is, high level plan, budget. All of those pieces go into the identification and how you come up with a mitigation plan. And once you come up with that mitigation plan though, we would then have to execute, of course, on the mitigation plan that we came up with. But so now you have the mitigation plan, but you also want to create an entire roadmap that will help you see from a sequential standpoint those things that I would have to do in order to be proper for my security environment. Now, one thing that sometimes people don't do is they try to do it from bottoms up standpoint with a roadmap, but it's very important to engage whoever your leaders happen to be, and obviously the subject matter experts. And then you have to look at the entire release cycle so that you can plan it appropriately, release it appropriately, understanding that things are constantly changing. So if we were to sum up what this is really talking about from a 6-stage process, we would just say that threat modeling takes a practical approach based on or focus on threat scenarios, crown jewel identification, technical resiliency. And mind you, all of this though is an agile approach consisting of key elements found in many other approaches. So I'm not suggesting that this is the only way to do it, but I am suggesting that, over time, this is what we've found that can work regardless of where you're trying to have an entry point. And so some of the other considerations, though, is that when you're thinking about an approach for threat modeling, I would recommend, encourage you to take into consideration using COBIT or TOGAF from a framework standpoint, especially obviously TOGAF from an architectural framework where you have your business application information technology domains. But you want to consider using this from an architectural level. I'm not suggesting implementing all of this, obviously, because COBIT and TOGAF in of itself are very elaborate and difficult to practice on a broader level, but you can take the architecture elements of this in order to build out a threat modeling approach. The other piece for consideration, though, is a risk-based threat assessment. And finally, the last piece would look at maybe resiliency. What's the resilience risk assessment as well? But the key here is I have to start somewhere. Here's a recommended approach. You don't want to boil the ocean, and you start with critical journeys. And so when we look at that, we say, okay, if we're starting with a customer journey, let's take this example. So we have Lisa, and her role is a staff manager. And Lisa is a staff manager, and she needs to look at subscriptions, okay, manage subscription items. And so what you would see, though, is that you would have really 5 different points for Lisa to be concerned with, or as the overall security person, we want to be concerned with different items for Lisa. The first one that we're concerned with is when we look at the stage for managing subscription as a customer journey, as a user journey, we see that there's identification here. How do we administer change? So identify administrative change, okay, for Lisa. Then there's the access management tools. And finally, for Lisa, it's getting to managing the actual subscription. So those are the stages. Now, again, as I said previously, this is just an example of a customer journey. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow it this exact way, but this customer journey helps you to look at it from in this case, from an internal standpoint, but you can have a customer journey that looks at it from an external. So it's an internal or external user. And the point is that you should build a journey. And when you're building this journey, at least in this particular case also, where we see stages and now we have process areas. So what's the big deal here for the process area though? Well, I've listed out a number of items in the process area associated with each stage: identify administrative change, access management tools, and manage subscription, right? So in the process area, I call your attention to the yellow boxes though. The yellow boxes here indicate what are the key questions that one needs to ask for process areas. So in this case, under identify administrative change, what are the requested activity sequences? Here we have issue and alert notifications all the way down to my e-commerce store. What I'm suggesting is that you have to ask the question for each one of these buckets. What are the key questions? So if you look at that and then you move to the right to access management tools, the takeaway there is which solution components, though, enable request processing. So we have to look at that. Do we look at e-commerce store? Do we look at inventory manager? Do we look at CRM? What are those? And those are the questions that we're asking that will help us fill what we're coming to after this. And so once you get to manage subscriptions, the question becomes, well, how are these entitlements managed then and assured? As it relates to those bullets that you see there. And so after that, you come down to current state challenges. So I have my stages, I have my process areas for Lisa, and now I'm looking at what are the challenges really that Lisa would experience or that she is experiencing. And so then it becomes, well, based off of these current state challenges, how are they delivered, right? And then once you get to management tools, well, how are these entitlements managed and assured as well? Once we're here, what is the identity management piece here? Well, how do I really focus in on that? These are questions that are inputs into building your solution, but also understanding what the customer journey is. And then when you get down to high impact moments, you're saying, what components and information assets are critical to enable the service? What do I really need? What do I really have to look at? Okay, so how do I understand those pieces? And so you think about it and you say, well, if my customer journey is providing insight into into all the data flows, and it's providing insight into the systems involved, just remember, this is a feeder into the solution model. And as a feeder into the solution model, and when we're thinking about solution components and we're thinking about information assets, we think about it from the context of is that some examples of those would be What's my Active Directory domain controller? Do I have any application gateways, load balancers, web servers, payment processing systems, or payment processing gateways? Are they going to be in my actual solution model? Am I using any containers? Are those containers like Kubernetes? What am I using? Are they an HR? Are they an HR system, customer identity, access management? What are the pieces? And am I doing customer identity? Am I doing customer account transaction records? Or is this just purely about employee records? The point here is that when you build out your customer journey is so critical to understanding any piece of threat. The customer journey helps you, in a pure sense, itemize at a very high level different places where threats could occur. And the reason that I say it that way is because when you build out that customer journey, it feeds directly into that solution model. And if you look at the solution model says, if I'm starting with administrator, which is what Lisa is, right? And I'm following her journey all the way through into the internet, down into a VPC, through the internet gateway, all the way through private subnets, and then obviously to third-party pieces. What do I have to consider when I'm looking at the solution map then? And so I would encourage you, when you're thinking about this and when you're looking at this as an example from a solution mapping standpoint, you have to take into consideration, especially when you're looking at this slide, is what is the data center, okay, that I have to be concerned with. I have to pay attention to my data center. I have to pay attention to my networking components. I have to pay attention to infrastructure, to applications. I have to pay attention to any components whatsoever that are being managed by external providers. The point is that in your solution model, one has to pay attention to all aspects of how the data is flowing. And so this is the initial stage when you're doing threat modeling. It's basically capturing current state where we can identify important trust zones and where we can identify our network security boundaries. We can identify our data flows and show how the customer journey is supported by all of the solution components. So that's what the solution model allows for us, critical element for threat modeling. And then after we do that, though, as I mentioned earlier, we have to identify what are the crown jewels really? What are these mission critical pieces that we have to be concerned with? And one thing that we should consider, a few things that we should consider when we're thinking about crown jewels, I like to sum it up in this fashion. Crown jewels really are those things that impact my brand. They have a revenue impact as well. And so when you're building out and when you're answering a question about revenue impact and brand impact, this also is placed in the actual architecture diagram. And you ask these questions to identify what the crown jewels are. And you see here, there are various qualifications for crown jewels, okay? Whether it's a database of trade secrets such as chemical formulas or technology blueprints or even testing data can be considered in some instances as a valuable asset or as a crown jewel. You could think of it even from the perspective of a CRM, a customer relationship management system, where that system actually contains customer PII. And if you're thinking of from that perspective, just think about it. If that is compromised, that represents a high risk, which will impact your brand and will impact revenue for your particular entity. So also, since I mentioned PII, which is personally identifiable information, that's also at the core of consumer privacy regulations such as GDPR, or CCPA. So that's why in this instance or in that context, those are very important pieces of information as it relates to threat modeling. So remember it this way, threat modeling helps us to understand how data stores of regulated information could be at risk and what kind of threats must be considered for mitigation. And so if you have an architecture component, for instance, and it suffers damage through a cyber attack, the brand of that organization or of that company may be impacted due to poor service or because of a data breach in of itself. And so after we've identified the crown jewels, then we move to develop threat models. And in order to do that, though, what I indicated before and before the slide is that we would look at two different types of ways to do this, right? So we look at, most of us are familiar with Stride. So we look at Stride, and just for those who may not be familiar, as you see here on the slide, Stride is that spoofing, tampering, in those items, repudiation, and as such. So you'll get these slides, I'm assuming, and so you can read what they mean here. But my point is I'm just showing this so that you understand that we're using Stride to determine what can go wrong, and we're using MITRE ATT&CK, to understand how we define the attack vectors, and we join those two together, and at the end we get a threat model library. And so if you think about the combination of Stride and MITRE, they present what I would consider a practical approach to threat modeling, and primarily because the methods are simple, they're well known, and they are pretty much effective. And it's perfect for an organization beginning to use threat modeling. But the threat modeling library, though, should be established to enrich the technology development programs that one would have at their particular company or location. Now, mind you, even though I'm using Stride and MITRE here, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that you could use. You could also use PASTA, which is out there, that's Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis, or you could also use VAST, which is Visual, Agile, and Simple Threat. And so, but for what I'm suggesting, we're using Stride and MITRE. But again, you could use PASTA, you could use VAST if you desire to as well. The point is that you get to a place where you have to, or where you should have, a threat model library. And so moving on, if we look at MITRE, for instance, and we look at MITRE ATT&CK, and you understand that this basically what it does is it assists us in understanding the sequence of activities. So let me say that again. It assists us in understanding the sequence of activities. And what that means is that is our attack vector. And so it helps us because a threat actor may, this is what a threat actor may employ in mounting an attack. And the knowledge base, which is this library, is maintained currently by a community of organizations and subject matter experts, primarily because this changes so frequently, okay? And let me move along. I see time coming on me. And so let me give you two quick examples. So when we're thinking about threat models, here's an AWS example, and you see from an AWS standpoint, you see the customer journey. This is still Lisa, remember, this is still the customer journey. So you see where Lisa started, and you see all the different points where Lisa is moving through from her work to do managing subscriptions. But the point here real quick is that if you look at the customer journey and you follow it all the way through, you see various places where there could be threats that could occur. So whether it's at the beginning with spoofing, whether it's at the end over here from the third-party standpoint, looking at spoofing, looking at tampering, looking at information disclosure. Even in the crown jewel box, you see where the crown jewels are. The point here is that when you develop your threat model, you should be able to walk through the entire threat model and notate where it's possible, where things could go wrong for your particular situation. The model demonstrates key areas in AWS where threat actor can take advantage or might take advantage of opportunities to compromise a particular organization. But the model also shows, though, it shows threats inside and outside of the trust zone, okay, which is very important. It's fine we're looking internally, but we also have to look externally as well. Now, that's one example from an AWS standpoint, but look at here also. Look at the GDPR example. It's a technical example. It shows exactly, again, what could happen, starting from the beginning over here with that customer, going all the way through over even into the data center, even into marketing research. This is third party. All of these things are important. It just allows you to lay this out. So your threat actor may compromise a third party, sensitive data, as I mentioned, CRM. And when you do that, it results in a breach that can disclose private data. It could even, in this instance, it could be an email system that might be attacked and used to compromise customer accounts, which is what we saw with the SolarWinds piece. But it's also a threat actor who may spam customers with marketing notifications without consent. And that is in violation of GDPR policies. So the reason I'm showing this to you is that we then have threats for many different stakeholders, right? And so then this is essentially what this is, just an attack vector. So this attack vector, it leverages MITRE ATT&CK. This essentially helps us build out our attack vectors to show what the mitigation happens to be. And then when we get to our next slide here, we show it in descriptive format. So we know what our vectors are, then we list out what our risk statement happens to be and how we're going to mitigate those risks. And then finally, or last two, once we realize that, then we identify our plan for mitigation based off of everything that we just laid out, right? So we say, okay, I'm going to do it this particular way. I'm going to take a threat modeling and I'm going to think of it from an iterative approach. And I'm going to look at what my plan could be based off of my attack vectors. Now, attack vectors, though, should be reviewed and prioritized for your planning. Okay, so one should include the subject matter experts who you can consult with that will help you as it relates to your attack vectors. Then you validate this effort and then you optimize it. And after you optimize it and you validate it, you come to the final slide where you say, I'm going to take all this information now and I'm going to put it on a roadmap and I'm going to execute against my plan. I'm going to prioritize high-risk items first. I'm going to look at my solution design. I'm going to look at my release cycles, and I'm going to consider all this as I sequence it for activities for mitigating my threats in a general roadmap. Okay, so again, prioritize, validate threats, identify mitigation, create a change management plan, incorporate whatever those changes happen to be, and the wonderful piece at the end is you're going to test mitigations so that you know that they are effective. Now, as I close, there are a number of various tools out there in the market that are available to leverage and protect each layer of the solution that we've just walked through quickly today. Whether you're talking about AWS from a web application firewall standpoint, or AWS Shields for DDoS attacks, or Prisma for broader cloud security. Even Twistlock, if you're thinking about from a container and from a Kubernetes standpoint, you can use those. But I just wanted to show you real quick for these last 30 minutes, just some ideas, just some things to think about from a threat modeling perspective. So I'm going to close there. I appreciate the time, and I'm going to turn it back over to you, Frank.